The air at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, was thick with the scent of pine needles and diesel fuel, a smell that clung to the uniforms of every soldier. It was a place of sharp lines and sharper attitudes, where respect was measured in push-ups, and the grit on your boots. For most it was a world of camouflage and combat drills, of early mornings on the firing range, and long marches under a relentless sun. But for Specialist Anya Sharma, it was a world of paperwork, logistics, and the quiet hum of a computer. Anya was assigned to the supply depot, a sprawling warehouse filled with everything a modern army needs, from Mr. E's to tank treads. Her job was to keep track of it all, a meticulous dance of numbers and codes that ensured the warfighters on the front lines had what they needed, when they needed it. She was good at it, exceptionally so. Her mind was as organized as the shelves in her warehouse, each item in its place, each detail accounted for. But in the testosterone-fueled culture of an infantry-heavy base like Bragg, her contribution was often overlooked, if not outright dismissed. To the grunts, the men who lived and breathed the dust of the training fields, she was just a desk job girl, a cog in a machine they didn't care to understand. The mockery wasn't loud or overt, not at first. It was in the smirks she'd get when she walked into the mess hall, the way conversations would dip to a whisper, followed by a burst of laughter. It was in the condescending tone they used when they had to interact with her, as if explaining their needs to a child. The ringleader of this casual cruelty was Sergeant Rex Mad Dog Maddox, a man whose neck was as thick as his skull. Maddox was a caricature of a drill sergeant, all bluster and bravado, with a booming voice that could peel paint. He and his crew from Alpha Company saw soldiers like Anya as little more than civilians in uniform, soft hands who wouldn't last a day. In the real army, Anya, for her part, endured it with a quiet dignity that seemed to infuriate them even more. She was not a large woman. Her frame was slender, and her movements were precise and economical, a stark contrast to the swaggering gait of the infantryman. She had dark, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, and a calm demeanor that she had cultivated since childhood. Her father, a retired Army colonel, had taught her that the greatest strength was often the one you didn't need to show off. Let them underestimate you, he'd always said. It's the most powerful weapon you'll ever have. The friction came to a head on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. A critical shipment of night vision goggles had been misplaced. An Alpha Company was slated for a nighttime training exercise. Maddox, predictably, stormed into the supply depot, his face a thundercloud. Sharma, he bellowed, slamming a meaty hand on her meticulously organized counter. Where are my NVGs? We're supposed to be in the field in 2 hours. Anya didn't flinch. She looked up from her monitor, her expression unreadable. Good afternoon, Sergeant. I'll need the requisition form number to track your shipment. Maddox scoffed, a sound like gravel grinding. I don't have time for your paperwork games. Just find my gear. It's probably buried under a pile of your romance novels. His two corporals, who stood behind him like a pair of trained dogs, snickered. Anya's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She typed a few commands into her keyboard, her fingers flying across the keys. The shipment for Alpha Company, requisition 72 for Delta, was signed for at 0900 this morning by a Corporal Evans, she said, her voice even. My system shows it was delivered to your company's supply locker. That's impossible, Maddox snarled. My guy said he came here, and you gave him the runaround. Anya swiveled her monitor to face him. On the screen was a digital signature, a messy scrawl that clearly read CPLT Evans. Is this not your corporal's signature? Maddox stared at the screen, his face turning a shade redder. He was cornered by facts, a place he clearly wasn't comfortable. Instead of admitting the mistake was on his end, he deflected, turning his anger back on Anya. You think you're so smart, sitting here with your little computer? He sneered. You wouldn't know a real soldier's work if it hit you in the face. You're soft. This whole generation is soft. Back in my day, we didn't hide behind desks. Anya stood up, her 5'6" frame seeming to gain a few inches. My job is to ensure you have what you need to do yours, Sergeant. I do it well. That's all that should matter. What matters is grit. Maddox shot back, leaning over the counter, invading her space. What matters is knowing you can handle yourself. When things get dirty, and I'm willing to bet you'd fold like a cheap tent. The challenge hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Anya could have reported him. She could have called her commanding officer and had him reprimanded for harassment. But she knew that would only make things worse. It would be seen as her running away, proving his point. She thought of her father's words, of the years of training he had put her through, not just in discipline and intellect, but in other, more physically demanding arts. A slow, deliberate calm settled over her. What are you suggesting, Sergeant? Maddox grinned, a predator's smile. He thought he had her. I'm suggesting a little friendly competition. My best man against you, hand to hand, no weapons. We have our combatives tournament coming up. Think of it as a preliminary match. If you win, I'll carry your damn computer to the mess hall for a week. But when you lose, you admit that desk jobs are for people who can't hack it in the real world. His corporals whooped and hollered, smelling blood in the water. The news would be all over the base in an hour. The desk job girl was going to fight one of Alpha Company's toughest. It was a joke, a spectacle. For them, the outcome was a foregone conclusion. Anya looked past Maddox, her gaze distant for a moment, as if calculating a complex inventory. Problem then. Her dark eyes snapped back to his, sharp and focused. Fine, she said, her voice clear and without a tremor. You're on. Pick your best man. We'll do it Friday, after the morning formation. On the main training mat, a stunned silence fell over the depot. Even Maddox seemed taken aback by her immediate acceptance. He had expected her to crumble, to refuse, to give him the satisfaction of calling her a coward. He had not expected this. Anya simply sat back down, turned to her computer, and began typing. Now, if you'll excuse me, Sergeant, she said, not looking at him, I have a job to do. Maddox stood there for a long moment, a strange mix of fury and confusion on his face. He had set a trap, and his prey had walked right into it, not with fear, but with a chilling sense of purpose. He grunted, a sound of dismissal, and turned to leave, his corporals trailing in his wake, already boasting about the beating their friend was going to deliver. As the door slammed shut, Anya stopped typing. She closed her eyes and took a single, deep breath, the scent of pine and diesel filling her lungs. The warehouse was quiet again, the only sound the hum of the computer. On the screen was the inventory list, a neat column of numbers and names. But in her mind, she was seeing a different kind of list, a different kind of inventory. She was cataloging every move, every hold, every strike her father had ever taught her. The desk job girl was about to clock in for a different kind of work. Word of the challenge spread through Fort Bragg like a wildfire. It was the main topic of conversation in the chow lines, the barracks, and the motor pools. The story got more embellished with each telling. Some said Specialist Sharma had cried. Others said she had begged. The prevailing narrative, pushed heavily by Maddox and his cronies, was that the desk job girl had been bullied into a fight she had no hope of winning. It was a source of great amusement for the infantry units, a welcome distraction from the monotony of training. Bets were being placed, and the odds were laughably skewed. Corporal Tyson Evans, the man chosen to be Maddox's champion, was a mountain of a man. He was the reigning combatives champion for their battalion, a former high school wrestling star who had found his calling in the army. He was known for his raw power and aggressive style, often overwhelming opponents in the first few seconds. The idea of him fighting Anya was, to most, like pitting a grizzly bear against a house cat. Evans himself was cocky but not malicious. He saw it as a bit of fun, a way to put a cocky REMEFA derogatory term for re-echelon personnel in her place. It's nothing personal, he told his buddies in the barracks. Maddox wants to make a point. I'm just the exclamation mark. Anya, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to the storm of gossip she had created. She continued her work at the supply depot with the same unwavering focus. She processed requests, updated inventory, and ensured that units got their gear on time. Her calm was unsettling to those who came to the depot hoping to see a nervous wreck. They would find her just as she always was, composed, professional, and polite, but her routine had changed in subtle ways. She started her days an hour earlier, not at the base gym, which was now filled with curious eyes, but in a small, forgotten corner of the post, a clearing in the woods behind an old, disused storage building. There, as the sun began to paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, she would move through a series of exercises that were a far cry from standard Army PT. It was a fluid, graceful, and brutally efficient martial art her father had insisted she learn. He had served in special operations, and had seen firsthand that a fight was not always about size or strength. It was about leverage, timing, and exploiting an opponent's momentum. He had started teaching her when she was just 10 years old, not to make her a fighter, but to make her disciplined, confident, and capable of protecting herself. The mind is the weapon, Anya, he would say, his voice a gentle guide as he corrected her stance. The body is just the tool. A smaller, sharper tool can be more effective than a clumsy club. So, in the quiet solitude of the Carolina woods, she practiced. Her movements were a blur of motion, a dance of controlled power. She would strike at imaginary targets on the trees, her hands and feet landing with a soft thud. She practiced falls and rolls on the damp earth, conditioning her body to absorb impact. She was not training to beat Corporal Evans. She was training to remember. She was reawakening a part of herself that she had kept dormant for years, a part that had nothing to do with spreadsheets and everything to do with survival. Not everyone on the base was laughing at her. Master Sergeant Frank Miller, a veteran of 3 tours and the NCO in charge of the entire supply division, was a man who valued competence above all else. He had seen Anya's work ethic and her sharp mind and had nothing but respect for her. He had also seen the likes of Maddox come and go, men who mistook volume for leadership. He called her into his office on Wednesday, 2 days before the fight. Sharma, he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. He gestured for her to close the door. I've heard the talk. You know you don't have to do this. I can shut it down right now. Maddox is out of line. I appreciate that. Master Sergeant Anya replied, her hands clasped behind her back. But I have to. If I back down now, they'll never let it go. It won't just be me they target. It'll be everyone who doesn't fit their narrow definition of a soldier. Miller studied her for a long moment. He was a shrewd judge of character, and he saw no fear in her eyes. He saw resolve. Your father was Colonel Sharma, wasn't he? I served with him once, a long time ago. He was a tough man, but a smart one. He wouldn't have put his people in a fight they couldn't win. Anya simply nodded. All right, specialist, Miller said, leaning back in his chair. I won't stand in your way, but I'll be there on Friday to make sure it's a fair fight. His support was a quiet affirmation that meant more to Anya than he could know. It was a reminder that not everyone judged her by her job title. The day before the fight, the atmosphere was electric. Maddox and his crew were in full peacock mode, strutting around the base as if they had already won. They walked past the supply depot, and Maddox cupped his hands around his mouth. Hope you got your sick leave forms filled out, Sharma, he yelled. To the delight of his entourage, you're gonna need Anya was inside, conducting a final check on a shipment. She heard him, of course. Everyone in the building heard him. She paused for a fraction of a second, her hand hovering over a crate, and then continued her count. The insult, like so many others, slid off her like water off a duck's back. She was focused on a different calculation now. That evening, she didn't go to the mess hall. She ate an MRE in her barracks room, the simple meal of a soldier in the field. She cleaned her uniform, pressing it with military precision. She laid it out for the next day. Then, she sat on the edge of her bed and called her father. Hi, Dad, she said, her voice softer than anyone at Fort Bragg had ever heard it. Anya, his voice came through, warm and familiar. Everything all right, kiddo? Everything's fine, Dad. Just wanted to call and say hi. They talked for a few minutes about nothing in particular, his golf game, the weather, her mother's garden. She didn't mention the fight. She didn't need to. He had taught her everything she needed to know. Just hearing his voice was enough. It was the final piece of her preparation, the centering of her spirit. Remember what I told you about bullies, Anya? He said, just before they hung up, as if he somehow knew. They rely on fear and intimidation. Take that away from them, and they have nothing left. I will, Dad, she promised. I love you too, kiddo. Be smart. She hung up the phone and looked at her reflection in the darkened window. The face looking back was not the desk job girl. It was not Specialist Sharma of the supply depot. It was the daughter of Colonel Sharma, a soldier in her own right, ready to face the challenge she had accepted. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. The mockery had been a spark, and it had just ignited a furnace. Friday morning broke clear and hot. The humidity was already rising with the sun, promising another sweltering Carolina day. The space around the main training mat, usually quiet at this hour, was buzzing with activity. It seemed like half the base had turned out to watch the spectacle. Soldiers from various companies, off-duty personnel, and even a few curious officers lined the perimeter of the large, open-sided pavilion that housed the combatives' training area. The mood was festive, like a tailgate party before a big game. Maddox was in his element, holding court in the center of the crowd. He was laughing, slapping backs, and soaking in the attention. Corporal Evans stood beside him, looking relaxed and confident. He was wearing standard PT gear, his muscular frame on full display. He did a few light stretches, rolling his thick neck, a smirk playing on his lips. He looked like a man about to engage in a light workout, not a serious fight. Then a hush fell over the crowd as Anya Sharma walked into the pavilion. She was also in PT gear, but her presence was a stark contrast to Evans's casual arrogance. She walked with a deliberate, unhurried pace, her eyes focused straight ahead. She carried no anger or fear on her face, only a profound and unnerving calm. Master Sergeant Miller was with her, as promised, his stern expression a clear warning to anyone who might think of interfering. Anya walked directly to the edge of the mat, ignoring the whispers and the stares. She began her own warm-up, a series of slow, deliberate stretches that looked more like yoga than a pre-fight routine. The crowd murmured she looked so small compared to Evans. So delicate. Maddox swaggered over to the center of the mat. All right, listen up, he boomed, his voice echoing through the pavilion. This is a friendly bout. Rules are simple. No strikes to the face, no small joint manipulation. The fight ends with a submission or a tap out. Got it. Evans nodded eagerly. Anya, still stretching, simply raised a hand in acknowledgement without looking at him. Maddox grinned. All right, Evans. Sharma, center of the mat. Evans bounced on the balls of his feet as he moved to the center, a picture of coiled power. Anya finished her stretch and walked to meet him, her steps light and silent. They stood facing each other, the physical disparity between them shocking. Evans was a good head taller and easily had 100 pounds on her. He looked at her with a mixture of pity and amusement. You can still back out, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. No shame in it. Anya finally looked him in the eye. Her dark eyes were like chips of obsidian, cold and hard. Let's just get this over with, she said, her voice flat. The referee, a neutral NCO from another company, gave the signal. Fight. Evans lunged immediately, just as everyone expected. His strategy was simple: close the distance, grab her, and use his superior strength to slam her to the mat and force a submission. It was the strategy that had won him dozens of fights. But Anya wasn't there. As he lunged, she moved. It wasn't a panicked retreat. It was a fluid, lateral sidestep, a pivot on the ball of her foot that was so quick, so efficient, that Evans's grasping hands closed on empty air. He stumbled forward, his own momentum carrying him past her. The crowd let out a collective ooh. Evans grunted in frustration, turning to face her again. He was more cautious this time. He circled her, his hands up, looking for an opening. Anya stood in a low, balanced stance, her hands held loosely at her sides. She wasn't circling. She was just waiting, a picture of absolute stillness. He lunged, again, this time faking high and then shooting low for her legs. A classic wrestler's take. It was a move that should have been unstoppable. But as he shut in, Anya's body seemed to collapse downward. Her hand shot out, not to block him, but to guide him. She placed her palm on the top of his head, and as his momentum carried him forward, she used it to push his head down and to the side. Simultaneously, she dropped to one knee and hooked her other leg behind his, sweeping his feet out from under him. It was a perfect example of using an opponent's strength against them. Evans, all 230 pounds of him, was suddenly airborne. His own forward momentum converted into a rotational fall. He hit the mat with a thunderous crash that shook the entire platform. A collective gasp went through the crowd. No one had ever seen Corporal Evans taken off his feet before, let alone so effortlessly. Before he could even process what had happened, Anya was on him, but she didn't try to pin him or strike him. She moved with the speed and precision of a surgeon, flowing around his flailing limbs. Evans tried to scramble to his feet, to use his raw power to push her off, but she was like smoke, impossible to grab. She secured a position on his back, her slender legs wrapped around his thick torso in a body triangle that squeezed the air from his lungs. Her forearms slid under his chin, seeking the choke. Evans panicked. He tried to stand up, to slam her against the mat to break her hold, but her grip was like iron. He was carrying her on his back like a macabre backpack. Maddox was screaming from the sidelines, "Get her off you, Evans. Just stand up, throw her off." But Evans couldn't. The choke was sinking in. His vision began to tunnel. The cheers of his friends faded into a dull roar. He could feel his strength draining away, his powerful muscles useless. The desk job girl was squeezing the life out of him, her technique flawless, her pressure inescapable. He had a choice: pass out and be humiliated, or tap out and be humiliated. He chose the latter. He slapped his hand frantically on the mat. Tap, tap, tap. The referee blew his whistle. Stop. The winner, by submission, is Specialist Sharma. The entire pavilion fell into a dead, profound silence. The only sounds were Corporal Evans gasping for air on the mat and the soft thud of Anya's feet as she dismounted him. The fight had lasted less than 30 seconds. Anya stood up, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. She wasn't even breathing hard. She looked down at the defeated Corporal Evans, not with triumph, but with a neutral expression. She offered him a hand. "Good fight, Corporal," she said. Evans, his face a mask of shame and disbelief, ignored her hand and rolled away. Scrambling off the mat as quickly as he could, Anya turned her gaze from him and let it sweep across the crowd of stunned faces. She saw the shock, the confusion, the dawning respect. Finally, her eyes landed on Sergeant Maddox. Maddox looked like he had been struck by lightning. His mouth was hanging open, his face pale. The smug, arrogant mask had shattered, replaced by raw, undiluted fury and humiliation. His best man, his champion, had been dismantled in seconds by the very person he had mocked and belittled. He had made a spectacle, and he had ended up being the clown. Anya held his gaze for a long moment, letting the silence stretch. Then, she gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. She had won. She had done what she said she would do, and she had done it without malice, without taunting, without lowering herself to his level. She turned and walked off the mat. "Master," Sergeant Miller falling into step beside her. As they walked out of the pavilion, a single person started to clap, then another, and another. Within seconds, the stunned silence was replaced by a wave of applause, a spontaneous and genuine show of respect from the soldiers who had come to see her fail. They had witnessed something incredible, a perfect David Goliath story played out on a dusty training mat at Fort Bragg. The desk job girl had not only won the fight, she had won their respect. But as she walked away, Anya knew this was far from over. She had won the battle, but the war with Sergeant Maddox had just begun. The applause that followed Anya out of the combatives' pavilion was a sound that Fort Bragg hadn't heard before. It wasn't the polite clapping for a superior officer or the rowdy cheering for a sports team. It was a raw, spontaneous outburst of respect for the underdog. The soldiers who had gathered to watch a joke had instead been given a lesson in humility. The story of the 30-second fight was already becoming legend, spreading from the training grounds to the command buildings. With the speed of a text message, in the immediate aftermath, the base was divided. The majority, especially the younger soldiers and those in support roles, saw Anya as a hero. She had stood up to a bully and won, not with brute force, but with skill and composure. She had shattered the stereotype that a soldier's worth was determined by their job title. The supply depot, once a quiet backwater of the base, suddenly became a place of pilgrimage. Soldiers would find excuses to request supplies, just to get a look at the woman who had taken down Corporal Evans. They'd approach her counter with a newfound deference, their sirs and ma'ams replaced with a quiet, respectful specialist. Anya handled the newfound fame with the same grace she had handled the mockery. She was polite, professional, and deflected any praise about the fight. "I was just defending the honor of the Logistics Corps," she'd say with a small smile, a phrase that Master Sergeant Miller had suggested and which she found suitably formal and impersonal. She didn't want to be a celebrity. She just wanted to do her job and be left alone. Corporal Evans, for his part, was deeply humbled. After the initial sting of his defeat, a grudging respect began to form. He had been beaten not by luck, but by superior technique. He had been arrogant, and she had taught him a lesson. A few days after the fight, he appeared at her depot, alone. He stood at the counter, shifting his weight, his eyes downcast. "Specialist Sharma," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. I wanted to apologize. For my attitude, and for everything." Anya looked up from her work, her expression softening. "Apology accepted, Corporal. It takes a big man to admit when he's wrong." "Yeah, well," he said with a wry, self-deprecating smile. "You showed me I'm not as big as I thought I was. The guys, they're giving me a hard time. Calling me Tap-Out Tyson? It'll pass," Anya said. "Give it a week, and they'll have something new to talk about." She paused, then added, "You're strong, Corporal, but you rely on it too much. You telegraph your moves. If you learned to be more efficient, you'd be twice the fighter you are now." Evans looked up, surprised by the unsolicited advice. It was a genuine critique, a piece of professional courtesy from a superior practitioner. "You'd give me advice. We're all on the same team, aren't we?" Anya replied simply. It was an olive branch, and Evans gratefully accepted it. The encounter was witnessed by a few other soldiers, and the story of his apology and her gracious response only added to her growing reputation. But not everyone was singing her praises. In the barracks of Alpha Company, the mood was sullen and resentful. Sergeant Rex, Mad Dog Maddox, was consumed by a cold, burning rage. He had been publicly humiliated. His authority, which was built on a foundation of fear and intimidation, had been cracked. His men, who once looked at him with unquestioning loyalty, now had a flicker of doubt in their eyes. Maddox couldn't accept that Anya had beaten Evans fairly. In his mind, it had to be a trick, a fluke. He started spreading rumors that she must have used some kind of illegal move, that the referee was incompetent, that she had somehow cheated. He told his men that she was a snake, that her quiet demeanor was a front for a manipulative and deceitful nature. She got lucky, he'd snarl to anyone who would listen. A lucky grat, that's all it was. You put her in a real fight, a dirty fight, and she wouldn't last 10 seconds. His poison began to seep into the cracks. A small but loyal contingent of his followers adopted his narrative. They saw Anya's victory not as a display of skill, but as an affront to the natural order of things. Infantrymen were supposed to be the tough ones. Desk jockeys were supposed to be weak. Her victory had turned their world upside down, and they didn't like it. The tension between the supply depot and Alpha Company became a palpable thing. The casual insults were replaced by a tense, hostile silence. When Maddox or his men had to interact with Anya, their words were clipped, their eyes filled with contempt. Maddox, true to his word, had to perform his punishment. But he did it with a theatrical resentment. Each morning for a week, he would stomp into the depot, grab a spare computer monitor, which he insisted was her computer, and haul it to the mess hall, slamming it down on a table with a loud bang, as if to prove how little the humiliation meant to him. It was a childish display that made him look even smaller in the eyes of most, but it solidified his defiance. Master Sergeant Miller watched the unfolding drama with a wary eye. He knew men like Maddox, their pride was a fragile thing, and when wounded, it could make them dangerous. "Be careful, Sharma," he warned her one afternoon. "A dog's quiet right before it bites. Maddox isn't the type to let this go. He's looking for a way to get back at you." "I know, Master Sergeant," Anya said. "I'm keeping my eyes open." The real test came a week later. Alpha Company was scheduled for a major field training exercise, a multi-day event that required a massive amount of equipment. The requisition order was one of the largest Anya had ever seen. It was her job to ensure every piece of gear, from ammunition to medical supplies, was correctly allocated, packed, and ready for transport. She and her team worked for 2 days straight, meticulously checking and double-checking every item against the list. It was a complex logistical puzzle, but Anya thrived on such challenges. On the morning of the deployment, the trucks from Alpha Company arrived to pick up their supplies. Maddox himself was there to oversee the loading, his eyes scanning every crate with a predatory focus. "Is it all here, Sharma?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Or did you get distracted practicing your little dance moves and forget something?" "It's all here," Sergeant Anya replied calmly, handing him the final checklist. "Verified and signed off. Every item you requested." Maddox snatched the clipboard from her hand and watched as his men loaded the last of the pallets onto the trucks. He was looking for a mistake, any small error he could use to crucify her, but he found none. The paperwork was perfect. The inventory was exact. With a final glare of hatred, he signed the form and drove off, leading his convoy into the sprawling training grounds of Fort Bragg. Anya watched them go, a strange sense of unease settling over her. It had been too easy. Maddox had given up too quickly. She had a nagging feeling that she was missing something. She went back inside and pulled up the requisition order on her computer, her eyes scanning the long list of equipment one more time. Everything was there. Every box was checked, and then she saw it. It wasn't an item on the list. It was an item that was missing from the list. A standard-issue piece of equipment that should have been on any order for a multi-day field exercise. It was a small thing, easily overlooked by someone not intimately familiar with both logistics and field operations. But Anya was familiar with both. The requisition order for Alpha Company, the one signed by Sergeant Maddox, had not included a request for emergency water purification tablets. For a 3-day exercise in the middle of a Carolina summer, it was not just an oversight. It was a critical failure, a recipe for disaster. A cold dread washed over her. Maddox wouldn't make a mistake like that. He was a lot of things, but he was an experienced NCO. He knew the importance of water. So if it wasn't a mistake, what was it? Her mind raced, connecting the dots. The fight, his humiliation, his obsessive need for revenge, his presence at the depot, watching her, waiting for her to fail. And suddenly she understood. The trap hadn't been for him to find a mistake in her work. The trap was for her to perfectly execute a flawed order. He hadn't forgotten the tablets. He had deliberately omitted them. He was setting her up to take the fall. When his men started suffering from dehydration in the field, an investigation would be launched. The first thing they would look at would be the supply request, and it would show that Specialist Sharma had filled the order exactly as requested. She had given them everything they had asked for. No one would believe that an experienced sergeant would forget something so basic. The blame would inevitably fall on the desk job girl who didn't understand the needs of the war. It was her word against his, and he was counting on his rank and reputation to win. It was a devious, brilliant, and incredibly dangerous plan. He was willing to risk the health of his own men just to settle a score. Anya stood in the quiet of her depot, the hum of the computer, a low thrum of warning. She looked at the clock. Alpha Company had been gone for less than an hour. They were heading deep into the training area, where communication was spotty. She had a choice. She could report her suspicions to Master Sergeant Miller, let the chain of command handle it, or she could handle it herself. She knew that if she went through official channels, it would become a bureaucratic mess. It would take time that the men of Alpha Company didn't have. By the time an order was issued, they could already be in serious trouble. She looked at the signed requisition form, at Maddox's arrogant signature. She thought of the soldiers in his company, young men who were just following orders, who trusted their leader to take care of them, and she made a decision. She went to her own locker, grabbed her field pack, and walked over to the shelf where the water purification tablets were stored. She packed several boxes, enough for a whole company. Then she walked out to the motor pool, her face set with a grim determination. The battle on the mat had been for pride. This one was for something far more important. The Fort Bragg training area is a vast, sprawling wilderness of pine forests, sandy trails, and murky swamps. It's a place designed to test soldiers, to push them to their limits. Navigating it requires skill and a good map. Anya had both. She also had a printout of Alpha Company's training schedule, which she had accessed through the base's shared network, a perk of being a logistics specialist with high-level security clearance. She knew their route, their objectives, and their likely rally points. She managed to sign out a Humvee from the motor pool, a process made easier by a friendly sergeant who owed her a favor for tracking down a lost shipment of spare parts for him the month before. He raised an eyebrow at her request, but didn't ask too many questions. Anya's reputation for quiet competence preceded her. As she drove, the paved roads of the main post gave way to dusty, rutted tracks. The air grew thick and still, the sounds of the base replaced by the chirping of insects and the rumble of the Humvee's engine. She was alone, heading into a situation that was growing more dangerous by the minute. This was no longer about a personal grudge. Maddox's actions constituted a willful endangerment of his troops. It was a serious offense, one that could end his career, and she knew he wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who could prove it. She found Alpha Company's bivouac site late in the afternoon. It was nestled in a clearing, tents set up in a defensive perimeter. The men looked tired, their uniforms dark with sweat. The Carolina sun had been merciless, and the humidity was draining. She parked the Humvee at the edge of the clearing and got out. Her field pack slung over one shoulder, Her arrival was met with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. A couple of young privates, guarding the perimeter, raised their rifles. "Halt! Who goes there?" "Specialist Sharma, Supply Depot," she announced, her voice calm and clear. "I have a supplemental delivery for Alpha Company." One of the guards recognized her. "It's the ... It's Specialist Sharma," he said to his partner, his voice filled with awe. The commotion drew others from their tents, including Sergeant Maddox. When he saw her, his face, already red from the heat, darkened with fury. He stomped towards her, his fists clenched. "What in the hell are you doing here, Sharma?" he snarled, his voice a low growl. "This is a secure training area. You're not authorized." "I brought you something you forgot," Sergeant Anya said, her voice even. She swung the pack off her shoulder and opened it, revealing the boxes of water purification tablets. She held one up. "You're running low on potable water. Your men are going to start going down with heat exhaustion by morning if they don't rehydrate properly." A murmur went through the soldiers who had gathered around. They had, in fact, been grumbling about the water situation. Their canteens were nearly empty, and the only nearby source was a stagnant-looking creek. They had been told to expect a water resupply, but it hadn't arrived. Maddox's eyes darted around, seeing the questioning looks on his men's faces. He was trapped. He couldn't deny they needed the tablets, but accepting them from her was another humiliation, an admission of his failure. "We have the situation under control," he lied, his voice tight. "We were just about to call in a water buffalo. We don't need your help. Your training schedule says you're supposed to be maintaining radio silence for the next 12 hours. Anya countered, her knowledge of his plans unnerving him. "And the nearest water buffalo is 10 miles away. Your men need these now." She wasn't just challenging his authority anymore. She was exposing his incompetence in front of his entire company. The loyalty of his men, already strained, was beginning to fray. They looked from their suffering comrades to the life-saving tablets in Anya's hand, and then to the sergeant who was refusing them out of pure pride. "I gave you an order, Specialist," Maddox roared, taking a step closer until he was towering over her. "Get in your vehicle and get the hell off my perimeter." "No, Sergeant," Anya said, her voice dropping, but losing none of its steel. "I will not. My duty is to ensure soldiers are properly supplied. Your pride is not more important than their lives." This was it. The final line had been crossed. Maddox's rage, simmering since the fight, finally boiled over. He saw his career, his reputation, everything he had built, crumbling because of this woman. In his twisted mind, she was the enemy, the one who had to be eliminated. "You're in violation of a direct order," he screamed, his face contorted in a mask of pure hatred. "You are officially relieved of your duties and detained." He reached out to grab her. What happened next was a blur of motion. As his hands shot out, Anya reacted on pure instinct, the same instinct that had saved her on the training mat. She dropped her pack, sidestepped his clumsy grab, and used his own momentum against him. She grabbed the fabric of his uniform at the elbow and shoulder, pivoted, and dropped her hips. It was a classic hip throw, executed with flawless precision. Sergeant Maddox, all 250 pounds of him, was lifted off his feet and sent flying through the air. He landed with a sickening thud on his back. The wind knocked out of him in a loud whoosh. The entire company stood frozen, their mouths agape. They had just witnessed their formidable, feared leader get thrown to the ground like a sack of potatoes for the second time by the same desk job girl. But this time, it was different. This wasn't a sanctioned match on a padded mat. This was a real confrontation, and Maddox was not going to take this defeat lying down. He scrambled to his feet, his face a terrifying shade of purple. His eyes were wild, unhinged. All pretense of discipline was gone. "I'll kill you," he shrieked, and he lunged at her again, his hands reaching for her throat. Anya didn't have time to think. She reacted. As he came at her, she dropped into a low stance and drove the heel of her palm upward, a strike aimed at his chin. The blow snapped his head back, stunning him for a precious second. It wasn't a knockout blow, but it was enough. It gave Corporal Evans the time he needed. Evans, who had been watching the scene unfold with a growing sense of horror, finally acted. He and two other soldiers who had had enough of Maddox's tyranny rushed forward. "Sergeant, that's enough," Evans yelled, grabbing one of Maddox's arms. The other two soldiers grabbed the other. Maddox thrashed like a wild animal, trying to shake them off. "Get off me. That's an order." "No, sir," Evans said, his voice firm. He was no longer the cocky young corporal. He was a soldier doing the right thing. "It's over." They managed to restrain the struggling sergeant, whose face was now a mess of sweat, dirt, and tears of pure rage. He had lost control completely, and everyone had seen it. Just then, the sound of another vehicle approaching cut through the tension. A Humvee, flying the flag of the base's command sergeant major, bounced into the clearing and screeched to a halt. Master Sergeant Miller jumped out of the passenger seat, his face grim. Behind the wheel was the highest-ranking enlisted soldier. On the entire post, Miller had been worried when Anya hadn't returned. He had done some digging, pulled up the same requisition form, and noticed the same missing item. Knowing both Anya and Maddox, he had feared the worst, and had immediately escalated the situation. The command sergeant major, a man whose presence commanded instant respect, took in the scene at a glance. The exhausted soldiers, the defiant Anya, Sharma, and the struggling, unhinged Sergeant Maddox, being restrained by his own men. "What in the name of the United States Army is going on here?" he boomed, his voice cutting through the air like a razor. Maddox stopped struggling, his face draining of color. He was finished, and he knew it. "Command Sergeant Major," Anya said, stepping forward and saluting crisply, her composure unshaken despite the chaos. "Specialist Sharma, I have a report to make." She stood there, in the heart of the Carolina wilderness, surrounded by the men who had once mocked her. She had faced down her tormentor, protected his soldiers from his madness, and was about to bring his reign of terror to an end. The truth was her weapon, and she was finally ready to use it. The command sergeant major's investigation was swift and thorough, in the quiet, air-conditioned confines of an official hearing room, far from the heat and dust of the training field. The truth came out, piece by damning piece. Corporal Evans and the other soldiers who had restrained Maddox gave their statements, their voices clear and steady. They spoke of the sergeant's obsession with Specialist Sharma, his constant belittling, and his reckless pride that had led him to refuse the water tablets. They described his unhinged rage and his assault on an unarmed soldier. Then, Anya presented her evidence. She laid out the timeline with the precision of a logistician. She produced the original requisition form, signed by Maddox, clearly lacking the request for water purification tablets. She presented a copy of the training schedule, showing that he had planned to be out of communication, effectively cutting his men off from any help. She explained her reasoning for delivering the supplies herself, her voice calm and factual, devoid of emotion or vindictiveness. Her testimony was a masterclass in clarity and logic. It was irrefutable. Maddox, stripped of his bluster and his cronies, tried to lie. He claimed the omission of the tablets was a simple clerical error. He accused Anya of being insubordinate, of manufacturing the crisis to make him look bad. But his story was full of holes, and his credibility was shot. His attack on Anya, witnessed by his entire company, was the final nail in his coffin. It was a clear-cut case of conduct unbecoming a non-commissioned officer, dereliction of duty, and assault. The consequences were severe. Sergeant Rex Mad Dog Maddox was stripped of his rank, dishonorably discharged from the United States Army, and escorted from Fort Bragg in disgrace. His reign of intimidation was over. The small group of followers he had cultivated quickly and quietly distanced themselves from him, their loyalty vanishing as quickly as his career. The aftermath sent ripples throughout the base. The story of what had happened in the field became a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride and the abuse of power. But more than that, it became the final chapter in the legend of Specialist Anya Sharma. She was no longer just the desk job girl who won a fight. She was the soldier who had used her intelligence, her courage, and her integrity to save a company from its own leader. She had proven that a soldier's value wasn't in their job title or their physical strength, but in their character. Anya, true to her nature, wanted no part of the accolades. She quietly returned to her post at the supply depot, hoping to fade back into the quiet rhythm of her work. But things had changed. The respect she now commanded was deep and genuine. The smirks and whispers were gone, replaced by nods of acknowledgement and greetings of specialist. She had become an unlikely and unwilling role model. A few weeks later, Master Sergeant Miller called her into his office. The command sergeant major was there with him. Anya's heart skipped a beat, but their expressions were not severe. They were smiling. "Specialist Sharma," the command sergeant major began, his voice warm. "Your actions have been reviewed at the highest levels on this post. What you did took a rare combination of courage, intelligence, and integrity. You upheld the highest values of the Army." He slid a folder across the desk. "You've been promoted to sergeant, effective immediately. Furthermore, we've approved your application for officer candidate school. Your father was a fine officer. We think you will be too." Anya was speechless. She stared at the promotion orders, at the official letter of acceptance. It was more than she had ever expected. "But that's not all," Master Sergeant Miller added, a proud grin on his face. "We're restructuring the combatives training program on this base. We want to put less emphasis on brute force and more on technique, leverage, and discipline." The command sergeant major and I were in agreement about who should help design and lead the new program. He looked at her expectantly. "We want you, Sergeant Sharma. We want you to teach." Anya looked from Miller to the command sergeant major, a wave of emotion washing over her. To teach, to pass on the lessons her father had given her, to help shape a new generation of soldiers, to teach them that strength came in many forms. It was a responsibility she had never sought, but one that felt right. A slow smile spread across her face. The first genuine, unguarded smile she had shown in a long time. "I would be honored, sir." And so, the next chapter of her story began. The woman they had mocked as the desk job girl became one of the most respected instructors at Fort Bragg. Her classes were always full, attended by soldiers of all ranks and roles, from hulking infantrymen to slender intelligence analysts. She taught them how to fight, yes, but she also taught them something more. She taught them about control, about discipline, and about the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can handle yourself. No matter what the world throws at you, she never saw Maddox again, but his story lingered as a reminder. And sometimes, when a new soldier would arrive, full of swagger and arrogance, and cast a dismissive glance at a soldier working at a computer or in an office, an older, wiser NCO would pull them aside and tell them the story of Sergeant Anya Sharma, the desk job girl who beat their best man in hand-to-hand, and in doing so, taught them all what it truly means to be a soldier.